this heart gallery right here, this of these images, this dissected heart right here, it's not labeled, but you can use exercise two's pre-lab to practice, to know the answers, to be able to label this. Because students, they pull this up and they go, well, Dr. B, that's great, we have this, but there's no key, it doesn't tell us the answers to this. Well, yeah, but it does in the pre-lab. So, make a key from the pre-lab, and then you have the blank ones that are unlabeled here, so you can practice labeling them and things like that. But definitely use this heart gallery right here, which is this right there. Definitely use that to help study, in addition to the Quizlets that we're going to use. Because even from a model perspective, the pictures of the models, and I won't, I'm going to be very kind of beat around the bush as I say this. These model pictures have the possibility of being the model pictures that end up on the lab practical. All right. So I would definitely study these pictures. So you can use the Quizlet pictures to help you label these pictures. But the Quizlet pictures are not likely to be what's on the practical. These would have a better chance of being on the practical, if that makes any sense whatsoever. So take that for what it's worth, but definitely take time to look at this. I'm actually going to use some of these to go back and identify a few of the things on these models, because there are a couple of different views like this that we don't have in the Quizlets. So I'll actually use these to go back and kind of identify a few things that aren't identified on the Quizlets today as we go through the lab. All right, any other questions before we get rolling here?
I had a question about one of the answers on a pre-lab quiz. Um,
Okay.
for one of the pictures, it kept marking wrong for subclavian left artery, but
So
it was marking it wrong based on the spelling. So I wanted
here's
to make sure. I'm sorry. Go
here's
ahead.
here's no here's the thing with and this is why I do the pre-lab exercises. This is why I go back through and give you full credit for them. When it's fill in the blank, the key in Canvas is so sensitive that if you have something capitalized that's not capitalized, it may mark it wrong. If you put an extra space because it's using, some type of logarithmic, formula to make sure that your answer is correct, if you put a space and then start the word, sometimes that marks it wrong. So there's a lot of different things. It could also be that the answer's in the key. If it was left subclavian artery, we have to go plug in the answers to those when we make those up. And so we try to put in every possible combination, like the word left written out, subclavian written out with just the letter A for artery, or the letter L with subclavian written out and the word artery, or L subclavian A. So we try to put all the combinations in there, but if you happen to put a combination in there that's correct, but it just wasn't listed as an answer, it'll mark it wrong. So that's why I go through and just give you full credit, for completion, because we may have left out a combination when we put in the answers, because, you may have abbreviated left and capitalized subclavian, and we may have not have capitalized subclavian, and it may have marked it wrong. So on the pre-labs, don't sweat it. I want you to use those for practice, and you can do them as many times as you want, but I don't want you to spend 10 hours doing the pre-labs. If you got everything right but one, I don't want you to spend, an extra 2 hours trying to figure out what that one was and how to spell it right, because that's I'm going to end up giving you a 10 out of 10 on it anyway, because I'm grading it for completion. So, if you miss one because you can't, well, I can't, I've tried every combination possible. Don't continue to beat yourself up over it. Just leave it, because if it's on a pre-lab and it's a write-in, I'm going to give you credit for it anyway. All right.
All right.
All
Gotcha.
right. All right. We'll get this all figured out after the first couple of weeks. Y'all will get, used to the pre-lab write-ins and stuff like that. And you'll understand, a little bit more, because it's just a little different setup than it is in A&P1.
I have one more question,
Yeah,
Professor. I don't know if you spoke about the lab book.
I
Do
have
we
not.
what are do we really need to because I went to the bookstore yesterday, but they were closed. Um, we need the lab book for lab, right?
Well, you at least need the access, because to do the quizzes, like to do the Wiley quizzes and stuff like that, that's you have to have the access code at least to do the Wiley quizzes. So,
Right.
you can either buy the book in the bookstore and get the code, or you can come over here to Wiley Course Resources and just buy the digital version of the lab book for $45, and that'll give you the code. And then you'll have the lab manual digitally, but you'll be able to access everything at that point. So you at least need it from the standpoint where you need the code. Do you have to physically buy the book? You don't have to physically buy the book. You can have it if you want. You can print it out, which I did email because a question came up last week about the watermarks. I did send that to Dr. Rosenzweig, who's our chair, and she's the one that deals with the publishers and stuff like that. She was not aware that that had popped up the way that it did. And also, I noticed that it puts a printing cap on you of 10 pages per day or something like that, which she was also unaware of. So she's supposed to be reaching out to the publisher about that, to Wiley about that, because she wasn't aware of that. So hopefully something will get done about that. But, I did bring it up to her, and, I took screenshots and sent it to her and said, hey, did you know this is happening? She's like, no, I did not. So, hopefully that change will be in the works. But either way, you need to have access, either, like I said, buying the lab manual or, buying the code directly. So doesn't
Okay.
matter to me. But the lab manual in bookstore, I think, is like $70. The code is 45. So if you're good with just using the digital version, then I just would spend the $45 and get the digital version. And, you can always print it out if you need to. So,
Okay. All
all
right.
right.
Thanks for
All right. So again, I just wanted to kind of show you on here, the things that are available in Exercise 2. Definitely, like I said, download this PowerPoint with the heart image gallery. That's what I was just showing you right here. I would, maybe even print some of these pictures out so you could practice labeling on those. The heart model videos, again, like I showed you the videos on the endocrine system, Dr. Worrell does a great job. And if you're the type of person where you like to hear somebody pointing to the structures and identifying them and saying them out loud on the models themselves, kind of in 3 dimensions, he does a great job on the model videos as well. This Power Phys activity right here, this is tied to this physiology lab report. Now, the lab report is not due until the end of next month, okay? So it's not due until after we do the physiology exam. And what this is this is 6 bonus points on the physiology test. So what you're going to do here is you're going to open up this link, and it's going to actually take you then out to another resource, and it basically is going to give you a lab activity like we would do in class. The lab activity we would typically be doing in class is discussing cardiac output. What's your heart rate? What is your stroke volume? How to calculate these. So what this Power Phys exercise right here, and we're going to probably walk through this a little bit next week at the end of our blood vessels lab. What this is you're going to go through and basically do this like you would do an experiment in class. It'll ask you questions about cardiac output. It'll ask you to do some pre-lab reporting. Then you're going to go through data collections, and then you're going to formulate a lab report. When you formulate that lab report, you're then going to submit the lab report here. When you submit the lab report, then I'm going to look at it. If you put effort into it, and I can tell that you did all the steps you were supposed to do, even if your numbers aren't completely right, I'm going to give you full credit. So this extra credit is going to be a 6 points or a 0 points thing. So, if by the February 24th, you've done that lab report, and I can go in and look at the lab report and say, okay, yeah, everything is here the way that it's supposed to be. I'm going to add 6 points to your physiology test. All right. So you definitely want to take advantage of this because 6 points on a physiology test in here are 6 very valuable points, considering that the physiology is a little bit tougher. But again, you got till the 24th to do that. We're going to kind of walk through this power physics activity a little bit next week when we finish up the lab. And then if we need to talk about it a little bit more, we'll do so the following week. Remember, your first practical is 2 weeks from today. That's your first anatomy practical. I think that's February 11th. We are not scheduled to meet that day unless we have some physiology to go over. So next week we'll talk about this physiology activity. If we don't finish it up, then the following Thursday morning we may meet for a little while to talk about it. But we don't typically meet on the days that we have the anatomy practicals. Now the following week, when you have your physiology practical, we will meet because we have to talk about blood that morning. So we will have class that day, but you definitely, you're going to want to make sure that you don't forget about this lab report, because again, that's 6 easy points that you can get added to that first physiology test.
Will we be tested on the physiology that we learn the same day as the test?
No. So you mean on when we do the blood lab that day, the blood is on the second physiology test. So we just, in AMP2 lab, they split your practicals for the first 2 so that you don't have to take them both the same day, since they're 50 questions each. But because they split them, we can't just take up 2 class days with just tests. So, and this actually works out better than actually in person. Because when we meet in person on the physiology days, you literally take your physiology test to go sit in the hall and cry, and then come back in and you have to sit and learn about the blood. And which I hate, because everybody's mind is just completely melted after the physiology test, and now they got to pay attention and listen to me talk about blood. So if we're still, regardless of whether we're virtual or not, that day we'll meet and we'll talk, about blood. We'll look at blood models and things like that if we're meeting in person. If we're still doing this virtually, we'll meet at our normal class time. We'll talk about blood, and then the rest of the day you'll have to be able to do your physiology exam. So you won't have to do them back to back on that day. But it's better this way actually than it is when we meet in person and you have to do both on the same day. So, but no, that's on the next test. Here's the Quizlet link right here. So I've got that pulled up. We'll use that a little bit later. And then here's some heart dissection videos that, if you want to, again, hear somebody walk through the dissection of the heart. And if that helps you, understand the structures a little bit more, then you can do that. This is not done by someone from our campus. This is a outside source of somebody walking through and doing the anatomy. But if you like hearing it talked about, while you're looking at it, then that's available for you as well. All right. Any questions about, all of these resources? There's a lot of stuff available to you to help you learn for this. Again, from an anatomy standpoint, I would focus on the heart image gallery. I would use your pre-lab quiz, and I would use the Quizlets that we're going to use from an anatomy standpoint. From a physiology standpoint, what I talk about today, how I explain these things to you, the things that I highlight, you should maybe highlight in the lab handout for today, or the lab exercise in your lab manual. Because those are the things that I'm going to pull when I make the physiology test. All right. Because again, the anatomy tests are departmental tests that we all pitch in to make, but the physiology tests are individual. So you'll get my physiology test, and I make my physiology test off of what I talk about in class. So again, if I kind of brush over something and don't touch on it for a very long period of time, then assume that I'm probably not going to ask you, anything on that. Or if I talk about something very briefly, I may ask you a question or two. But if I spend a lot of time talking about something, then make sure that, that's something that you look at in depth for the physiology. All right, let me close a few of these windows up here, and we'll get rolling. All right, so let's talk about the heart. Well, let's talk about the cardiovascular system kind of in general first. The cardiovascular system is made up of three different parts. All right, we have the heart, which we're studying today, the blood vessels, which we'll do next week, and then the blood, which is going to be included on the second practical sets. The heart is basically going to be the motor that helps to run the cardiovascular system. The blood vessels are kind of the roadway, and the blood is going to be the means of transport that we utilize to get things from point A to point B, and that's the primary function of the cardiovascular system is going to be to transport things. Whether we're transporting oxygen or carbon dioxide, or whether we're transporting nutrients or hormones or pain medication or antibiotics, anything that needs to get from point A to point B in the body is going to do so through some type of circulation using the cardiovascular system. So the heart, like we said, this is the engine of the cardiovascular system. This is what gets things to where it needs to go. The heart is a giant muscle. It's going to be comprised mostly of cardiac muscle tissue, although there is, a fair amount of connective tissue kind of woven through the heart to help maintain the structural integrity of the heart itself. But for the most part, it's going to be a giant muscle. So just like other muscles in our body, we can train the heart. We can exercise the heart. We can make the heart stronger. The heart can get larger. And sometimes we may want the heart to be larger in certain capacities. Other times we don't want the heart to be larger, and we'll kind of touch on that as we go through the lab here a little bit today. The heart, you'll remember, is going to sit in the mediastinum. The mediastinum is that cavity that sits between the two pleural cavities in the thoracic region, and it's going to sit in its own subcavity of the pericardial cavity. Now, the pericardial cavity is, remember, made up of multiple layers of serous membranes. We're going to have a serous membrane that's directly attached to the surface of the heart that we call the visceral pericardium. And then we're going to have a parietal pericardium, which is going to surround the heart. And these serous membranes are going to secrete serous fluid, which is going to be used to create lubrication, which is going to help to prevent friction buildup between the heart and the surrounding tissues, and also provide a little bit of cushion around the heart as well. Now, the amount of fluid that we produce from those serous membranes is not going to be too excessive because the space that the pericardial cavity actually is not a very big space. If you had me for A&P1, you remember me talking about space and what defines space and how small spaces could be. That even this piece of paper folded over as tightly as possible still has a space between the two sides that are touching each other, because if there wasn't a space, they'd be the same piece of paper. So keep that in mind when we think about these spaces, and remember the amount of fluid is just enough to provide lubrication between those two regions. If we have an excessive amount of fluid produced, or if we have not enough fluid produced and we end up with inflammation associated with that, that can put pressure then on the heart. We don't want to put pressure on the heart. If we put pressure on the heart, then the heart has to work harder. And if the heart has to work harder, it's going to become less efficient. Now, if it's done at rest, all right, let me clarify that by saying if the heart works harder at rest, the heart will become less efficient. If the heart works harder during exercise, the heart will become more efficient. All right, so the heart working hard is good if it's done at elevated heart rates when we're asking it to be elevated. The heart working harder is bad when it's done when we're not asking it to work hard. So when you're at rest, if your heart rate is elevated, your heart is working too hard, that can end up being bad for the heart. So pressure on the heart will cause that, which could be because of too much fluid in that pericardial space. Now, again, these membranes, one we said is attached to the heart, that's the visceral layer, and one is attached to the body cavity wall, which is the parietal layer. When we look at this diagram right here, we can see the multiple layers. And when we really zoom in, we get a good idea of this pericardial cavity, this space right here. Now, we've got two layers of membrane. This right here is the visceral pericardium because it's attached directly to the heart. And the visceral pericardium is typically referred to just as the epicardium. Okay. The epicardium is the visceral membrane that attaches to the heart. We have our space, okay, which creates the cavity. And then across from that right here, this blue membrane, that blue membrane is going to be the parietal pericardium. Now, surrounding that parietal pericardium, we're going to have a layer of connective tissue because remember that parietal pericardium is simple squamous epithelium. That's what we make serous membranes out of, is simple squamous epithelium. And we know epithelial tissue has to be attached to some type of connective tissue or attached to something. So this fibrous pericardium out here is going to help to provide nutrients to the serous membrane that we have right here. Now, the visceral pericardium will just be attached to the heart itself. So it's going to get its nutrients from some of the blood vessels that run on the surface of the heart. So it doesn't have to be attached to a separate membrane because it's attached directly to the heart. Now, the epicardium is that serous membrane. And then the next layer of the heart that we'll see is going to be the thick muscular component of the heart right here. And that's what we refer to as the myocardium. So the myocardium is the muscular part of the heart. The epicardium is the outer serous membrane that attaches to the surface of the heart. And then lining the heart, we're going to have our endocardium. And the endocardium is actually going to be a layer of connective tissue and simple squamous epithelium. Now you say, why is simple squamous epithelium? Well, if you remember, when we talked about simple squamous epithelium way back in A&P 1, we said the simple squamous epithelium, one of the places that we found it was lining the blood vessels because we needed to be able to have gas diffusion take place. Well, guess what? It lines the entire circulatory system. We're not going to just have simple squamous epithelium in the blood vessels and then when we get to the heart have something else. So we'll have this, the endocardium be a layer on the surface, be a layer of simple squamous epithelium. Now, ironically though, even though we have simple squamous there, it's not going to allow for gas diffusion to take place. The heart does not get its oxygen from the blood that passes through it. The heart is going to get its oxygen from the coronary vessels that circle it on the surface. And we're going to identify some of the coronary vessels today. But as blood moves through the heart, it's not absorbing its nutrients and its oxygen that way. Number one, it's not in the heart long enough. And number two, that absorption and nutrient diffusion is only going to take place at the capillary level. We can't just do it through the walls of the heart. So we don't really have a model to show you these different layers. Typically on the models, what we'll do, and I'll kind of show you this when we look at the model today, we'll word the question in a way that'll ask you about the covering or the what we find at that part of the model. So, you know, if we put a line pointing to this part of the model right here and say, what layer of the heart is this? Then you would tell me myocardium. All right. If I put a line to the inside of the heart right here, let's look at this one here. If I put a line to the inside of the heart right here and said, what layer of the heart is this? You would tell me endocardium. So it's going to be very important that you read the questions on this test because you could have the questions will tell you what you need to answer. Okay. In here, we have different musculature. We have the endocardium lining. This is also the left ventricle. Okay, so, you know, there's a lot of different answers that could be given to something pointing to something in here. If the question says identify the chamber, then you would tell me right ventricle. If it says identify this structure, you would tell me the papillary muscle, which is what that is right there. If it says identify this layer, then you would tell me endocardium. So on the exam, make sure you read the questions because the questions are going to tell you how to answer lead you towards the answer for it. All right. Does that make sense? We kind of talked about that in A&P 1, you know, identify this bone, identify this bony marking. You got to read the question to be able to answer it correctly. That is going to definitely play a role in this. All right. So let's talk about circulation. All right.
Excuse me.
Yep.
Was that the anterior of the heart?
Yes, that's an anterior view of the heart.
Thank you.
All right. you can always tell the anterior from a posterior view, particularly on a diagram, because the apex of the heart right here is always is going to point to the left. All right. So if you're looking at an anterior view of the heart and the apex is pointing, or if you're looking at the heart and the apex is pointing to the left, then it's the anterior. Okay. So if this was from the posterior, that apex would be, pointing that direction like that, because the heart is going to sit pointing off to the left. Right. For reference, if you make a fist with your hand like this, that is about the size of your heart. All right. To give you an idea. And then the position of where your heart sits, if you take your fist, right, tip this down so you can see. If you take this right here, this is the thenar pad of your thumb. If you make a fist like this and you stick the thenar pad right on your sternum, okay, right there, that is about the, and you're using your right hand, that is about the shape and the size and the positioning of your heart, right? Your heart is not over here, okay? I know that's where we put our hand, we say put our hand over our heart, but technically our heart is right here, okay? We wouldn't want the heart over here. You don't want it on the left side over there because, what do we have to protect the heart over there? Well, I've got a few ribs, and in between those ribs, I've got space. But if I put the heart right here, what do I have to protect the heart? I have the sternum to protect the heart, all right? So the heart isn't over here. The heart is actually right there, okay? Which is one of those things that makes me crazy when I watch things like movies and TV shows and stuff, because, when they aim for somebody's heart, where does somebody always aim? They always aim over here. Well, that's a lung, okay? There's no heart right here. The tip of the heart may be, a little bit down here, but if you want to hit a heart, you're going to aim right there at the sternum, because that's really where the heart, the heart sits. So that's just a little reference, so everybody can kind of have an idea as to, where you're going to find the heart, because that's a common mistake, is that everybody thinks that it's way over there on the left-hand side. It does sit pointed to the left. Okay. That apex does point down to the left, which when we get to the respiratory system, you'll see how that affects everything in the respiratory system and in the cavities as well. All right, so let's talk about the basic structure of the heart itself, and then we're going to talk about the circulation of the heart. Our heart, as a mammal, is a 4-chambered heart. All right, not every animal has 4 chambers to their heart. Okay, birds have 2 chambers, amphibians have 3 chambers, reptiles and mammals are going to have 4 chambers. Now, what the 4 chambers do is they allow our heart to be super efficient. And allow our heart to beat with the greatest output, which makes sense, okay? Because reptiles and mammals are typically, as we think of them, the largest of the animal species, and so we need to have a heart that's going to be very efficient, because we have a lot of tissue to be able to pump blood to. A bird's heart doesn't need to be as efficient. It's more about speed and less about power. Because it needs to beat fast to be able to, to pump blood to the tissues to be able to sustain things like flight. Our heart is going to have 4 chambers. It's going to have 2 atria. All right. Think of the atria just like the word atrium. Okay. If you go into the atrium of the building, it's the entrance of a building. So the atria of the heart are going to be the entrance points into the heart. And that's where we're going to bring blood back to the heart. We're also going to have 2 ventricles. So the atria are going to be located superiorly, and the ventricles are going to be located inferiorly. We're going to circulate the blood from the right side off to the left side. Okay, so blood's going to return from the body into the right side of the heart. Now, here's where we come into the circulation. We actually have 2 different circuits of circulation. One is the systemic circuit, and the other is the pulmonary circuit. The systemic circuit is the circuit of circulation that is going to go to the body. And the pulmonary circuit is going to go to the lungs. Okay, I mean, pulmonary tells us lungs. So we're going to pump blood from the heart out to the body and then back to the heart. And then we're going to pump blood from the heart to the lungs and then back to the heart. So those are the 2 sets of circulation that we have. Now, these 2 sets of circulation are carrying different types of blood. One set of circulation is going to be carrying oxygenated leaving the heart and deoxygenated coming back to the heart. And the other set is going to be carrying deoxygenated away from the heart and oxygenated back to the heart. All right. Now, this will all make sense in just a minute. Just hang with me. So this right here kind of explains the path that the blood is going to follow. So I'm not going to read through this right here because I think that showing you a picture of it makes a little bit more sense. So we're going to take a look at these two diagrams right here to help explain the flow of blood, not only through the heart, but the flow of blood through the body and the pulmonary circuit. So we're going to first, though, define two terms, right? And the two terms we're going to define are arteries and veins. The definition of an artery is this: a blood vessel leaving the heart. The definition of a vein is a blood vessel returning towards the heart, coming back to the heart. That's the definition of artery and the definition of vein. Now, why am I pointing these out? All right. Well, because for the majority of your life and in the majority of the human body, we associate arteries with what color? Every science book you've ever looked in, everything you've ever drawn, everything you've ever written out, we associate arteries with red and we associate veins with blue, correct?
Yeah.
And 99% of the time, that's correct, but it's not always that way. Arteries aren't always red and veins aren't always blue. That's in the systemic circuit. That's in the body circulation. In the body circulation, arteries are red and veins are blue because arteries are carrying oxygen and veins are not. But in the pulmonary circuit, they're going to be backwards. They're going to be opposite. In the pulmonary circuit, our arteries are going to be blue and the veins are going to be red. Why is that? Well, the arteries are leaving the heart and going to the lungs. Well, if they're leaving the heart, going to the lungs, what do they not have? They don't have oxygen. Once they go to the lungs, they get oxygen, and then they do what? They come back to the heart. Well, if a vessel coming back to the heart is a vein, then that means a pulmonary vein is carrying oxygenated blood, and a pulmonary artery is not carrying oxygenated blood. So I'm pointing this out because when we start identifying the vessels coming off the heart here, you can't just use red and blue when we're talking about pulmonary vessels. Everything else in the body.
I get it wrong all the time.
Right. Everywhere else in the body, you can use red and blue. You see a red vessel in an arm, it's an artery. You see a blue vessel in a leg, it's a vein. But if it's going to the lungs or coming back from the lungs, they're the opposite. Going to the lungs, that's going to be blue, but it's an artery. Coming back from the lungs, that's going to be red, but it's a vein. So we are going to start our journey for circulation right here at this chamber, all right? This chamber is the right atrium, and the right atrium is getting blood back from the body. And it's going to get blood back from the body from three different places. It's going to get the blood back from the head and neck and the upper extremity, and that's going to be in this vessel here. We're going to identify these later. It's going to get blood back from below the heart through this vessel right here, and it's going to get blood back through this opening right there, and that's going to be blood coming back from the surface of the heart. So those three places are all bringing deoxygenated blood to the right atrium. The right atrium is then going to pump blood to the right ventricle. Now, as the right atrium pumps blood to the right ventricle, the blood is going to cross a valve. We have 4 valves associated with the heart. 2 of them are going to be between the atria and the ventricles. Those are called atrioventricular valves. 2 of them are going to be between the ventricles and the vessels. Those are called semilunar valves. Now this one right here, okay, going from the right atrium to the right ventricle, this valve is called the tricuspid valve, okay? So it's on the right side between the atria and the ventricles. So it's an atrioventricular valve called the tricuspid valve. So the blood's going to move from the right atrium to the right ventricle. The right ventricle is then going to pump blood towards the lungs. And when it does, it's going to eject blood over our pulmonary valve, which is what this guy is right here, and into our pulmonary trunk, which is this vessel right there. That pulmonary trunk is then going to split, okay? It's going to go to the left right here, and then it's going to go to the right underneath those vessels and come out right over here. Those vessels are the pulmonary arteries. Okay, arteries leaving the heart. So this is the left pulmonary artery, and going the other way would be the right pulmonary artery. So pulmonary arteries go to the lungs, they pick up oxygen. Once they pick up oxygen, now they got to come back to the heart. So a vessel moving back towards the heart is a vein. So we're going to have coming back pulmonary veins, okay, bringing oxygenated blood back to the heart. We've got a right set over here, we've got a left set over here, and they're all bringing blood back to this chamber here, which is the left atrium. Now, the left atrium is going to collect that oxygenated blood from the lungs, and it's going to pump it over another valve into the left ventricle. This valve is an atrioventricular valve on the left called the bicuspid valve. Now, you'll also see the bicuspid valve referred to as the mitral valve. So you may have heard someone or know someone that has mitral valve prolapse. This is the valve that is problematic with patients with mitral valve prolapse. Now, the way you can remember these valves, okay, and which one is which, this is on the left side, right? It's an atrioventricular valve, and it's called the bicuspid valve. So you got left, atrioventricular, bicuspid, LAB, lab. And on this side, you've got what? Right, atrioventricular, tricuspid, rat. So the mnemonic lab rat can help you remember that the bicuspid is on the left and the tricuspid is on the right. The blood from the left ventricle is then going to get pumped out to the body. So we have this oxygenated blood in the left ventricle that's going to get pumped out over the aortic valve, which is going to be located between the left ventricle and the aorta. And then from the aortic valve, we're going to pass out through the aorta, and we're going to begin to deliver this oxygenated blood to the body. It's going to circulate through the body. It's going to then pass through the capillary networks and deliver blood to the tissues. As we drop off oxygen to the tissues, we're then going to have deoxygenated blood, which will then return to the right atrium. And then the whole cycle starts over again. So blood back from the body, right atrium, right ventricle, out to the lungs. Back from the lungs, left atrium, left ventricle, oxygenated blood out to the body. So on this little flow chart right here, from the right ventricle through to the left atrium, that is the pulmonary circuit of circulation. So you can see right here where it says pulmonary arteries, and note that it's blue. Pulmonary veins, note that it's red. Once we leave the left ventricle, we then go out to the system, which then is going to be red in the arteries, blue in the veins, and then we come back to the right atrium. So this is one circuit. This is the second circuit. Does everybody understand the flow as we move through the heart and as we move through the body? That's the easy part. So, any questions about that before we head on? All right, what we're going to do next is I'm going to go in and we're going to start to identify some structures. So I'm going to pull up the Quizlet. We're going to go through the Quizlet and identify a few things since we're talking about anatomy and we're talking about flow and that type of stuff. Then when we get done talking anatomy, we're going to come back and we'll chat when we'll talk about the different types of cells that we have in the heart. The heart is going to be made up of cardiocytes, but those cardiocytes are going to come in two different varieties. One set, which only makes up about 1%, is going to be the autorhythmic part of the heart, which is the part of the heart that conducts electrical impulses and initiates the contraction of the heart. But the majority of the heart are going to be the contractile cells, which is the function of the heart itself. So we'll come back and we'll talk about the different types of cells. We'll talk about the different conduction parts, and then we'll look at those on a model. And then we'll get into looking at the EKG, and we'll talk about cardiac output. But let's go do some identification based off of this that we see right here. So let me grab the Quizlet. And we will do the anterior view of the heart first. Now again, I'm gonna label almost everything that's on the list that's labeled on here. When we took these pictures years ago, unfortunately the list was a little bit different at that point in time, which is why some of the things that are on here you're not going to see that are on the list. Some of the vasculature that's on the list that's in your lab manual. Let me go to the list right here. Some of the coronary circulation, I'm not going to identify some of these vessels. Typically for coronary circulation, I use the Quizlets for the coronary circulation. So if it's labeled on the Quizlet, then those are the vessels that you need to know, because actually the models that we have, they don't show some of these branches very well. Unfortunately, the models that we had. So some of these I'm going to not label. So if they're labeled on the model, then you should be able to identify, or on the Quizlet, those would be the ones that I'll make sure that you have to identify on the practical. All right. So when we look at the surface anatomy of the heart, there's really not that much to identify specifically. It's when we get inside that we'll start to be able to identify some of the muscles and some of the valves. But when we look at the surface of the heart, again, reading the questions on the exam is going to be a very important part of correctly answering the questions on the exam, because depending on how the question is worded can then dictate what that answer would be. For example, right here, what number 6 is pointing to. Number 6 is pointing to a structure. This structure sits on top of a chamber. So if we ask you to identify this structure, the correct answer would be the right auricle. The auricle are these ear-like flaps that sit over the atria, which actually extend the atria out a little bit to make them a little bit bigger. So if I ask you to identify this structure, you would tell me right auricle. But if the question said identify the chamber would be the right atria, because that's what's sitting right underneath this right auricle. So again, you just want to make sure you read the question and you give me what it's being asked. If I ask you for the structure and you tell me right atria, I'm going to mark it's going to be wrong. If I ask you for the chamber and you tell me right auricle, it's going to be wrong. So make sure you read the question and take your time. So this is the right auricle. Under it is the right atrium. Right here is going to be the right ventricle. Now, also, I could ask you, though, I could say what layer of the heart would be here, and then you would say epicardium, right? Because that's on the outside of the heart. Over here, number 11, this would be the left ventricle. And then up here, this would be chamber, the left ventricle, and structure would be the left auricle.
On the dissected heart that we did for the pre-lab, that had 2 arrows. It was the left auricle, and then there was like a kind of more towards what looks like the flap part that was labeled as something else, but I couldn't figure it out.
I'll check it out and see.
Okay.
I'll check. It may have been asking you, one arrow may have been representing the auricle and one arrow may have been representing the atria. But I'll take a look at it and see.
So it would just be those 2 options. I'm not missing it.
On the model, yeah, because on the model we can't differentiate on here, so we have to differentiate by the way that we ask the question. And probably even with the dissected heart, it would be the same thing. If we're looking for a chamber, the question will say identify this chamber. If it doesn't say identify the chamber, then definitely figure out what the structure would be.
So is the structure the same as the tissue? Because on the pre-lab it said tissue.
No, the tissue would more than likely be the layer, like the epicardium, the myocardium, and things like that, because at least I wouldn't label it as identify the tissue. I'll go back and see how they have it written and see what they've got. You're talking about on the pre-lab?
Yes.
Okay. I'll go check it out and see, is that on the model or is that on the dissected heart?
The model.
Okay. I'll check it out and see, and see how they worded it, and I'll clue y'all in as to how the questions are worded, because that's, I don't have control over when somebody's writing the questions, how they word it, and I know how I word my exams. So if it's worded a little bit different, I'll let y'all know. Hey, this is when they say tissue, this is what they're looking for, and so forth.
Okay.
All right, so we have our right ventricle here, and we have our left ventricle here. We have a structure, okay, that's kind of bracketed right here by number 9. Okay, that's this depression, which is going to run between the ventricles. So we use a term to describe things that are between. We say that it's inter, right? This structure is found on what of the heart? We're looking at the anterior of the heart. So this is on the front. It's between the ventricles, and it's a depression. What term do we use to describe a depression?
Sulcus.
A sulcus, right? When you're depressed, you sulk. So if it's on the front, it's between the ventricles, and it's a depression, it would be the anterior interventricular sulcus. All right. So that's what the structure is right here. That's bracketed by that. That whole structure running down the front of the heart is the anterior interventricular sulcus. Now, we have a couple of vessels that run in the sulcus. So again, if the question says identify the vessel, don't tell me anterior interventricular sulcus. That's not a vessel, okay? That is a structure. So, but if it asks for the vessels, number 13, the vessel running down the anterior interventricular sulcus, well, that's the anterior interventricular artery. Now, you'll also see it referred to as the left anterior descending artery, or abbreviated as LAD, okay? Left anterior descending, anterior interventricular, same vessel. Now, I like calling it the anterior interventricular just because that lets me know that it's in this sulcus. Now, a little information about the anterior interventricular artery. Its nickname, unfortunately, is the Widowmaker, all right? Why is it called the Widowmaker? Because this is the vessel that typically results in what we call a massive heart attack, where the kind of heart attack like my uncle had, where they said, he probably stood up from his afternoon nap and was dead before he hit the ground, like that kind of thing. And the reason for that is because this vessel supplies a huge amount of blood to these two ventricles, all right, particularly to this left ventricle. So if we block this vessel from bringing blood to these ventricles, and the ventricles are what's pumping basically all the blood out to the lungs and the heart, if we cut off the blood supply to that part of the heart dies, it's over. All right, there's very little that can be done, particularly because this is a main vessel. Now, the smaller the vessels they get blocked, obviously the less damage that occurs, or the less amount of tissue that's affected. So when we talk about a large blockage that's blocking this vessel right here, it's unfortunate that most of those patients don't recover from that blockage. Smaller vessels in different parts of the heart, like going to the atria, things like that, those are less problematic because they don't control most of the blood that goes out to the heart. Does that make sense? Okay. Sorry, I just had to check my phone. My son was emailing me or texting me. He knows I'm in class, so usually if he's texting me, it's something bad. But of course, it wasn't. So, go to class, do your schoolwork. All right. Next to our anterior interventricular artery, right here, we have a vein. And this is the great cardiac vein. All right, so number 12, running down the front, right there in the anterior interventricular sulcus, is the great cardiac vein. Now down here, the point of the heart, that is the apex, all right? Remember, apex doesn't mean top, all right? Apex means point. So the point of the heart is the apex of the heart, and the flat, wide part of the heart is going to be referred to as the base. Now, we have some great vessels up here, all right? And these great vessels are either bringing blood to or bringing blood from the heart. This first vessel right here, this is a vessel we saw on that diagram, and this is a vessel bringing blood back from the head, the neck, and the upper extremities, all right? And this is bringing blood deoxygenated into the right atrium. This is the superior vena cava. Now, we'll also have an inferior vena cava, which we'll see in just a few minutes, and that's bringing blood back from below the heart. So we'll bring blood back into the right atrium. We send blood from the right atrium to the right ventricle, and then it pumps out from the right ventricle towards the lungs. And this little short vessel right there is the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk then splits to the left and to the right, and those will become the pulmonary arteries. But this short piece right there is the pulmonary trunk. Again, we bring blood back from the lungs. That's going to go to the left atria, to the left ventricle, and then from the left ventricle, we're going to pump blood out over the aortic valve and into the aorta right here. Now, let me tell you something about blood vessels, right? Blood vessels are kind of like streets in New Orleans, all right, or streets anywhere really. Blood vessels can change names without changing direction or making a turn or doing anything, all right? I mean, you know that if you're driving down Bourbon Street and you cross Canal, it's not called Bourbon Street anymore, okay? It's Carondelet, okay? For you on the West Bank, if you're driving down Holiday, you know that Holiday is going to turn into Berman Highway, and then it's going to turn into Lapalco, and you never turned, okay? You're just driving straight, and it changes names twice, right? Blood vessels are going to kind of do the same thing. All right, we're going to be following a blood vessel, and it's just all of a sudden going to change names based upon where it is. All right, so we're going to use a lot of regional terms as we name these because that's where the blood vessel's found. All right, for example, the subclavian artery is going to be the subclavian while it's under the clavicle. Then it's going to move into the armpit region, and it's all of a sudden going to change names to the axillary artery. Well, the aorta is going to do the same thing. This part of the aorta right here is the ascending aorta. Why? Because it's going up. Then it's going to curve over the top. Guess what? As it curves over the top, it's arching over like this, so it becomes the aortic arch. And then actually when it gets down behind the heart and starts going down, it's going to be the descending aorta. Then it's going to move through the thoracic region. It's going to be the thoracic aorta. Then it's going to pierce through the diaphragm and it's going to get it into the abdominal cavity. Guess what it's going to be then? The abdominal aorta. It's the same vessel. We didn't branch off or anything. We're just renaming it based on location. So we've got ascending aorta right here, and then we have the aortic arch right there. And coming off of the aortic arch, we have three vessels. One of these vessels is going to go towards the right, and two of these vessels are going to go towards the left. The first vessel right here, number 3, is the brachiocephalic artery. Now, the brachiocephalic artery is going to soon, after it branches off here, after it leaves the aortic arch, it is going to branch into vessels that go where? It's the brachiocephalic artery. So where's it going to branch and go to?
The head,
The lungs,
Brachio is what?
the lung.
arms, and head.
Bronchial would be towards the lungs. But remember, the brachial region, it's going to go to the arms and the head, okay? So we're going to have two vessels that come off the brachiocephalic, that one of them is going to go to the arm and one of them is going to go to the head and neck.
Mhm.
All right. And when we do the vessels next week, you'll see that split. Now, the vessel that's going to go to the head and neck is going to be called the common carotid. The vessel that's going to go to the arm is going to be the subclavian, which is what we're going to have right here. So on the right side, we get the brachiocephalic artery, which is going to turn into those two vessels. But on the left side, we get the two vessels individually. Number 2 right here is the left common carotid. I know Mr. Russell has it just listed as carotid right here, but the full correct name of it would be the common carotid, because the common carotid is going to split to an internal and an external. Next to that, number 1 right there, that's going to be the left subclavian artery. All right, the left subclavian artery. Now, it was brought up at the beginning of class about putting an answer in like the left subclavian artery and, you know, it marking it wrong and things like that. On the exam, okay, when you take the exam from me, remember, I'm hand grading the exams. So when you take the exam from me, all you have to put for left and right is an L or an R. That's it, okay? You don't have to write out the word left. You don't have to write out the word right, okay? Just put an L or an R, capital or lowercase, doesn't matter. For artery and vein, all you have to put is an A or a V. You can write out artery if you want. You can write out vein if you want. But if you just put L subclavian A, I'll know you mean left subclavian artery, okay? I will typically allow you to abbreviate things if they were things that I abbreviated when I was in practice or when I was in school, all right? So you can put L subclavian A, and I will count that as left subclavian artery. It may mark it wrong on the test, but when I go back through and hand grade it, I'll give you credit for it. So again, brachiocephalic artery, left common carotid artery, left subclavian artery.
I have a question.
Yep.
For number 16, is that the aorta or do we label it as the arch?
That is the aortic arch, okay? When you're labeling the aorta, be specific with it, okay? Ascending aorta, aortic arch. When it goes down the posterior, call it the descending aorta, because, you know, when we get into the blood vessels next week, when the aorta gets into the below the diaphragm, it's going to be the abdominal aorta. So, you know, definitely be specific with the aorta as to the specific name of it. All right, let's look at our posterior view. I say posterior, but it's kind of a posterior inferior view. So here is the posterior / inferior view of our hearts. Now remember, if we're looking at something from the posterior, right and left is the same as you. Okay, when we look at something from the front, it's the opposite. When we look at something from the back, your right is their right and your left is their left. All right. So with that in mind, we have our pulmonary veins and we have our pulmonary arteries. So this would be the right pulmonary arteries. These would be the left pulmonary arteries. These would be the left pulmonary veins. These would be the right pulmonary veins. These are coming back to the left ventricle. These are coming from the left atrium. These are coming from the right ventricle. Now, I know Mr. Russell has this labeled as just aorta, but again, this is moving down. So correctly, you know, for practical purposes, this would actually be the descending aorta. Now, we mentioned bringing blood back from below the heart. We said above the heart was the superior vena cava. This opening right here is going to be for the inferior vena cava. So this is bringing blood back from the abdominal region. It's bringing blood back from the lower extremities, all going into the right atrium. Now, we talked about the vasculature on the surface of the heart, and we identified, oh, you know what? And there was one that I left off on the other one, but I'll show it to you in just a minute. The surface of the heart is going to get its blood supply from two vessels called coronary arteries, all right? As the blood ejects from the left ventricle, it's going to cross the aortic valve, and then there's going to be two vessels immediately that come off of the aorta. The first two vessels that come off of the aorta, and they're going to be the left coronary artery and the right coronary artery. And those coronary arteries are going to be the vessels that branch out then to supply blood to the surface of the heart. We then have to get the blood back from the surface of the heart. So we have all of these veins that are gathering then our deoxygenated blood from the surface of the heart, and they all have to get blood then back to the right atria. So we're going to carry blood back from all the veins on the surface of the heart, and they're going to all end up right here in number 3, which is called the coronary sinus. And the coronary sinus is then going to empty into the heart. You'll remember when I showed you the diagram up here, I said that we were going to bring blood back from this vessel, which is the superior vena cava, this vessel, which is the inferior vena cava, and then this opening right here, that opening where the arrow is pointing is the opening to the coronary sinus. So that is the opening for this vessel to bring blood back from the heart into the right atrium. Now we have a space right here, another depression. This one's on the posterior of the heart, but it's still between the ventricles. So this space is the posterior interventricular sulcus. That means that the vessel, the artery running down through that is the posterior interventricular artery. And next to the posterior ventricular artery is going to be the middle cardiac vein, which number 4 is number 7 right here is the middle cardiac vein. Which chamber is this?
The left.
The left.
Left ventricle.
Ventricle, yes. Okay. Yeah, y'all got left right. Y'all are like, oh, it's left. All right, what left? Left ventricle, yes. Look, we just said this is what? The interventricular sulcus. So this has to be a ventricle. So this is our left ventricle. This would be our right ventricle over here. All right. There's the apex of the heart right there. All right. Let me show you. Let me hop back real quick to the front view because I did leave one thing off here. I'm surprised nobody caught it because usually there's somebody keeping track at home. Right here, number 7, coming right here. That is actually your right coronary artery. All right. When we look at the sectioned heart in just a second, when this is removed, you'll be able to see the right coronary artery right as it comes off of the aortic, the ascending aorta right there, and it's going to come forward and it's going to run down through a sulcus. There's a sulcus that wraps around the heart like that we call the coronary sulcus. All right, and that's where the coronary artery is going to run. We can see it on the right side right here. The left coronary artery actually goes under the pulmonary trunk and then comes out over here as the anterior interventricular artery and then wraps around the left side of the heart like that. But we can see those better where they're cut on this frontal section. So it's not labeled on here, but you see right there, okay, that little vessel coming off of the aorta right here, that's the right coronary artery. All right, so immediately, like I said, the first vessels that branch off are the right coronary artery, and on the other side of that aorta, you can see it just barely right there. That would be the left coronary artery. Now, I'm not going to go through all the vasculature up at the top up here that we just did, okay, because it's all the same stuff that we labeled before. But this is a great model view to practice on because it has, that and the interior. But these vessels all up here, we already labeled, so I'm not going to go over all those specifically. But let's do the 4 chambers first. All right. So we have 4 chambers. This one right here is coming back from the body, bringing deoxygenated blood. That's where we started. So that is the right atria. We said the right atria pumped blood into the right ventricle. Okay, so the right ventricle would be this chamber here. He's got number 10 actually just kind of pointing to the chamber, so there wasn't any confusion with pointing to stuff in the chamber, but this is the right ventricle right here. Now, if I did point to this right there, to the muscular part, and I said identify this tissue or this layer, that would be the myocardium, right? Remember, that's the muscular part of the heart, and then the inside lining of the heart is going to be the endocardium. But here's our right ventricle. What valve is this that we're passing over going from the right atrium to the right ventricle?
Tricuspid.
Tricuspid. All right, remember rat on the right side. Each of these valves, these atrioventricular valves, they're going to be anchored to muscles in the ventricle. All right, you'll see these little They look like cords. Okay, these little cords coming down off the flaps of the valves. These cords are called the chordae tendineae. All right, these are connective tissue anchors, essentially, which are going to anchor to specific muscles that we have in the walls of the ventricles. So where the chordae tendineae anchor, those muscles right there are called papillary muscles. Now, we also have muscles that were found in the walls of the ventricles. These muscles are actually listed in the handout, so I'm going to identify them, even though Mr. Russell doesn't have them identified on here. But any muscle in the ventricle that's not a papillary muscle, okay, like these little ridges we see down here, those are called trabecular carnae. And the trabecular carnae are responsible for the actual contraction of the ventricle itself. These papillary muscles aren't responsible for contracting the ventricle. They're actually responsible for helping the valves to prevent backflow. And I'll explain that in just a minute here. So we pump into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, we're going to eject that blood and we're going to send it out to the lungs. Well, it's going to pass over this valve right here, and that is the pulmonary valve, right? Students oftentimes will answer this as the semilunar valve. The answer to this is not semilunar valve. That's the type of valve that it is. All you have to do for me is put pulmonary valve. You don't have to write out pulmonary semilunar. You can, but if you just put semilunar valve, it won't be correct because I need to know which one of the two semilunar valves it is. This is the pulmonary valve because that's the one that's leading to the lungs. We get the blood back from the lungs. It's now oxygenated. Okay, so that's going to put us into our left ventricle, our left atrium. We're going to pump blood from the left atrium into the left ventricle. That's going to cross number 15, which is our bicuspid valve or the mitral valve. You can put either one for me for that. It doesn't matter. The bicuspid valve is going to be anchored to more papillary muscles right here. It's going to be anchored using, again, the chordae tendineae, which are the attachments to the valve. Now, on the practical, if it's pointing to the valve, the question may say, identify this structure. If it's pointing to the cords, it may say, identify these cords, and then parentheses may give you a hint and say, not the valve. Okay, so if it says not the valve, then tell me chordae tendineae. And then from the left ventricle, we're going to pump blood over the aortic valve, which we can't see here. I'm going to show it to you on the this heart gallery, because I think there's a view on here that we can just catch the aortic valve. Yep, right there. Okay, here's our left ventricle. So if we tip ourselves down and we take a picture up going into the aorta, you can see right there, that's the aortic valve, right? So pulmonary valve, it's going to be attached to the pulmonary trunk. Aortic valve right there, that's leading into the aorta. And then we flow out through the aortic, the ascending aorta, aortic arch, and then onward. Let's talk about the valves for just a second here. Because the valves are there to prevent backflow, like any valve. Right? Remember, we want the flow of blood to go in a particular direction. Well, when the ventricle contracts, right, it's squeezing down on the blood this way. If you have two openings and you squeeze in the middle, what direction is the fluid going to go? It's going to want to go out of both openings, right? So we want to prevent it from going out of both openings, and we want it to just go out of the one that it's headed in the direction of, which means we need to close the other opening to force the blood to go in one direction. So that's what these valves are designed to do. When the atria are contracting, okay, when these two atria contract, these two valves are open. When these two atrioventricular valves are open, the two semilunar valves are shut. When the ventricles contract, these two valves are going to shut, and the two semilunar valves will open. So the heart will only ever have two valves open at a time. When the ventricle contracts, the two valves that are open are the semilunar valves, and the atrioventricular valves are closed because we don't want blood to go back into the atrium. When the atrium contract, those tricuspid and bicuspid valves are going to open, and the semilunar and the pulmonary and the aortic valves are going to close. So that means one set closes, the other set opens. The other set opens, the other set closes. Well, guess what, folks? The closing of those valves as they slam shut, those are your heart sounds. All right? The thump, 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 thump that we hear associated with a heartbeat, that's the physical closure of those valves as they slam shut. All right? That's where the sounds actually come from. Pretty awesome, right? Because you never knew. I mean, how many people ever really thought about and went, oh, you know what? My heart beats. And then you said, I wonder what makes the sound. Well, we never wonder what makes the sound. We just know it makes the sound. Where's the sound coming from? You know, is there a little guy in there on a pair of heart drums that he's beating or something? No, it's the valve slamming shut. All right. So you get one set that slams shut, and then on the next set of chambers contracting, you get another set that closes. So that's just a little pretty awesome little thing to know if you didn't know that already. Prolapse, okay, because we talked about mitral valve prolapse. Prolapse just means that the valve isn't closing properly. Why do we hear about mitral valve prolapse and not about other valves prolapsing? Because the left ventricle is the strongest ventricle. I mean, look, when you look at the wall of the left ventricle right here compared to the wall of the right ventricle, the left ventricular wall is much thicker, which means it's much stronger. Why is the left ventricle so much stronger than the right ventricle?
Because it's going out.
Yeah, it's going out to the body, right? I mean, look, if I'm pumping blood from the heart to the lungs, I don't have to go that far. But if I'm pumping blood from the heart to my big toe and then back, it's got to go a lot further. So the pressure on the systemic side is going to be significantly higher than what it is on the pulmonary side. And so the right ventricle doesn't need, in fact, we don't want it to be as big and strong as the left ventricle. We don't want to send the blood to the lungs with the same amount of pressure that we send out to the rest of the body. So, you know, I know this is an anterior view and everything, but if you get lost or confused or you have a brain meltdown or something and you can't remember left ventricle from right, look for the thickness of the wall. That'll also help you though on the dissection. When you look at the dissected heart, look at the thickness of the walls of the ventricles. The thicker ventricle is going to be the left ventricle. And then this is our interventricular septum. Okay, that's separating the left ventricle from the right ventricle. There's also an intraatrial septum. We saw the intraatrial septum actually a little bit. You can see it a little bit when you look at this picture right here. Okay, this wall right here, that's separating the right atrium from the left atrium. Now, one other structure that we don't see on the Quizlet, but I want to make sure I point out on here is this right there. That opening, or what looks like it used to be an opening, that is the fossa ovalis. All right. Now, the fossa ovalis in unborn babies or in developing babies is an actual opening. Okay, in utero, the right and left atria are connected. Okay, by this opening, blood's free to flow between the right and left atria, no problem. Why is that no problem? In utero, why can blood from the right and left atrium mix?
Because they're not breathing.
They're not breathing, which means that all the blood that passes through the heart has what? It has oxygen. Yes. Where's the unborn baby? Where's the in utero baby getting its oxygen from? Not from the lungs. It's getting its oxygen from the mother. Mm-hmm. So all the blood that passes through the heart is oxygenated. I mean, we're pumping blood through the pulmonary trunk here towards the lungs, but the lungs haven't inflated yet. So they're not picking up any oxygen. It's just moving towards where the lung tissue is and then coming back already oxygenated. So it's okay that we have this opening here because all the blood in the heart is oxygenated at this point. Now, obviously, before birth, we want this opening to close, and it should close, but sometimes it doesn't close. If this opening doesn't close prior to birth, then we get a mixing of deoxygenated blood from the right atrium into the oxygenated blood on the left atrium, which means that the blood in the left atrium that then is getting pumped out to the body has a lower oxygen content than it should. And at that point, we have to do surgery to be able to close that open hole in the heart, because otherwise you're pumping out less oxygenated blood to that newborn baby's body. And that's what results in what we refer to as blue baby, where they have cyanosis, and they can have a bluish tint to their skin or to their eyes and things like that. That's a good indication. And oftentimes they'll catch this, doing ultrasounds prior to the baby being born, and know that they have to do it, when the baby's born. Or if you remember, in A&P1, I talked about them doing in utero surgeries on babies. This would be one of those options where they might, do heart surgery on an unborn baby, which is just one of the most mind-blowing things you could possibly imagine. But remember, the regenerative healing powers of an unborn baby are higher than you're ever going to see in our lifetime. And so, sometimes they can go in and do surgery. The surgery is going to have to be done at some point in time. I mean, before birth, after birth, it's going to have to be done regardless. And so, there are very skilled doctors who might opt to do it at that point in time.
I have a question, Professor.
Yeah.
Is that the little hole that when the baby's born, they said the baby had a hole in their heart?
That's it.
But it closes up eventually on its own too, right?
It can. It usually closes before birth. And then if it doesn't, the doctors will say, hey, here's the situation. This is what's going on. It may close, but there's no guarantee that it will close. And so, at that point as a parent, you're like, oh, well, do I leave my baby with a hole in the heart and this and that, or do we go ahead and do the surgery for it? It's one of those things where it should, and maybe if it's mostly closed, depending on the size, then that might weigh into your options. They may say, hey, there's a hole there, but it's very small. It's almost closed. It's likely it'll close in X amount of time, and then you don't worry about it. But if it hasn't made any attempt to close, then and your baby's oxygen levels are too low, then that's when you would want to have some surgical intervention. But yeah, that's the hole in the heart that they typically reference with that.
Yeah, I was born with that hole in my heart.
And they didn't do, did they do surgery?
No, like you said, it wasn't that major, so
It wasn't severe enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have I know a couple of people that have had that, and theirs was severe enough that when they could see. I mean, you could see the second the baby took their first breath, you could see that the baby wasn't properly oxygenated. The baby actually had like this light bluish tint, like they were cold. And that's the type of situation that you worry about, because oxygen levels are supposed to be around 99, 97, 98. When you do pulse ox and how saturated the oxygen levels should be in the body, that's where they should be at. And when you start dropping down into the 80s or even into the 70s, that's when tissue, especially at that age, when tissue development is so happening so rapidly and so important, that's you want to make sure that you've got as much oxygen in there as possible. So again, it's based on the size of the unclosed hole, as to whether they do surgery or not. And but that's great. I'm glad that yours wasn't surgical, because there's nothing scarier from a parent standpoint than having your days old baby having to undergo heart surgery. But sometimes it's necessary. If we look here on the inside of this flap of the atria, you can see some of these muscles that line the atria on the underside of the auricle. Those muscles are actually called pectinate muscles. All right, so you'll see pectinate muscles on your list. That's what the pectinate muscles are, is in the atria themselves. Again, the ventricle is going to contain two types of muscles: papillary muscles, which are associated with the chordae tendineae, and then the other muscles that you kind of see not associated with the chordae tendineae back here, those would be the trabecular carnae that we mentioned just a few minutes ago.
I have a question.
Yep.
What view would you identify that view of the heart that we were just looking at? Because I was kind of struggling with that image, but I couldn't
Yes.
determine which. No, the one that we were just talking about with the whole. Yeah, this one.
This would
Like,
just
what
be,
view would you call that?
this is just a kind of a lateral view. You know, we're looking at this
Okay.
from the right side. So, you know, this we would just
Okay.
consider to be a lateral view. This would be an
Okay.
anterior view. There would be your posterior view.
Yeah, it's just this one particular image that I was really struggling with.
Yeah, we're like I said, we're just turning these heart. We just turn this heart model a little bit so we can see. Like there, you could just barely catch a little piece of the fossa ovalis right there. But this gives you just a better view of the right ventricles. So that's why they took a few extra pictures here so we could get better views than just the ones that we had on Quizlet and stuff. But that's what that would be.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate
Sure.
it.
No problem. All right. Any questions on the models, on the anatomy? Because that kind of wraps up the anatomy as far as what we can see, surface and internal. We've got one more model that one more view we're gonna look at on this, where Mr. Russell actually drew the electrical conduction out on the heart. But we're gonna take a look at that in just a second after we talk about it. But any questions about this stuff that we talked about?
I do have a quick question.
Sure.
In terms of studying the models, would you say it would be best for us to study Quizlet and the models that you provided us by making our own answer keys?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Like I said, most 95% of what's on Quizlet is on your list as well. But there were a few things, that I used, that I went back and used these images for, that I went and pointed out directly. Oh, and there's one more I just saw just now. Like showing you where the aortic valve was, talking about the pectinate muscles, talking about the trabecular-carne muscles. Those are things that we just don't have a good view of on Quizlet, but you should know those for the practical. And again, like I said, these pictures right here, in this heart model gallery, the department doesn't have these pictures that I have on Quizlet, because these are the ones that Mr. Russell and I took. They don't have these, so you won't see these Quizlet pictures probably on the practical. You'll probably see more of what you see in the pre-lab exercises and these heart galleries. So I would use the Quizlets to help you learn the structures, but I would kind of go back and then try to label them on these pictures. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. Now there's one other structure that I want to show you that is on your list that we don't have on the Quizlet, and that's this little piece of what looks like connective tissue right there. That little piece right there is called the ligamentum arteriosum. And what that is an atrophied remnant of a blood vessel. There in utero there's also a blood vessel that connects these pulmonary arteries right here to the aorta. Again, it's not an issue because all of the blood that's circulating through the heart and the vessels at that point going to and from the lungs is oxygenated. So, this can be open. And again, this atrophies, it closes off before birth and then forms this connective tissue ligament that you can see on different views. We can see it right there. You can just barely catch a glimpse of it right there between the inferior part of the aortic arch and the pulmonary arteries. So that's the ligamentum arteriosum. All right. Any questions on anatomy? All right. Then let's talk for just a few minutes about the cells of the heart. Typically on my physiology tests, I don't get into a very deep, discussion or ask a lot of questions as far as the electrical cycles go in the heart. Just because, there's other things that, that I think are more important, like cardiac output and total peripheral resistance and, the endocrine questions and things like that. And I know you're going to go into this in a lot of depth in lecture. So I'm just going to kind of mention as we go through here, what ions are going to be used and why some ions are important, particularly in assessing the health of somebody's heart, that they may or may not have had a heart attack. And then we'll go through, I'll identify the different parts of the conduction system. And then we do have a model that Mr. Russell has kind of drawn this on. So we'll take a look at the conduction system model just to give you kind of an idea as to where these things are located. Typically on the exams, we'll just kind of put an arrow in an area and say, in this area, what part of the conduction system would be located here? In this area, what part of the conduction system would be located there? And so you'll just tell me which part of it, but he kind of drew it out on the model, so it'll make a little bit more sense. So we'll walk through those and I'll tell you what each part of the conduction system kind of acts to contribute to conduction. And then we'll go over and talk about the EKG and cardiac output. So we mentioned before that there's two types of cells, autorhythmic and then contractile cells. The contractile cells, again, this is going to make up the majority of the cells, since that's the primary function of the heart, is to pump blood. So the majority of the cells are going to be responding to the electrical impulses, which are going to be created by those autorhythmic cells. But the autorhythmic cells are designed to tell the heart to beat. All right. One of the interesting things about the heart is that the heart is kind of disconnected from the brain. All right. I know, that's a kind of a popular saying outside of science, about the head and the heart being connected, or, whatever. But there really isn't a connection between the two. Yes. Does the brain have influence over the heart? It does. But it only has influence over the heart really in the capacity of speeding up and slowing it down. It can help control blood pressure by increasing and decreasing speed. It can help control, delivery of nutrients by increasing and decreasing speed. But the brain doesn't tell the heart to actually beat. The heart just, decides to beat on its own. That's the term. That's where autorhythmic comes into play. There are going to be sets of cells which are going to spontaneously depolarize and generate action potentials. I know, there go those terms again, right? Depolarization, action potential. You thought you were all done with those from A&P 1, but we're not, because, the heart's a muscle and it's capable of doing those things. So we're going to use, again, ions, just like we used in other muscle tissue and in nervous tissue. Those ions are going to be calcium and sodium and potassium. Now, calcium is going to play a very important role, though, more important than we saw in, not more important, but a different role than what we saw in skeletal muscle tissue. Calcium is going to play a role in initiating these depolarizations and these action potentials. So because calcium is so important, and it's going to be found in these excessive levels in the heart, calcium is a very good indicator of if a patient has had a heart attack, if there's been some type of damage to heart tissue. Remember, when tissue dies, it is going to typically lyse. Those cells are going to burst. So if we have high levels of calcium inside of those cells and these cells burst, then we're going to end up with high levels of calcium in the blood, much higher than we should. So, blood calcium levels are one of the things that they can check when a patient gets to the hospital to determine if the patient has had some type of incident of myocardial infarction. So, it's a good indicator, at least an indicator as to the health of the tissue as it pertains to the heart. So, we're going to go through this process of depolarization. The depolarization wave is going to continue from cell to cell using gap junctions and voltage gated channels. Those gap junctions that we see between the cells are called intercalated discs, and this is going to help to perpetuate the spread of the action potential through the cardiac muscle tissue. And the way that the cardiac muscle tissue is going to spread, the way the signal is going to spread, is it's going to begin at a certain spot. We have a pacemaker for the heart, which we call the sinoatrial node, okay, or the SA node. This is where the conduction is going to begin to tell the entire heart to beat, right? So the cells located here, which is going to be in the right atrium, inferior and kind of anterior to the superior vena cava, these are going to be the cells which are just going to spontaneously depolarize. And they're going to spontaneously, depolarize at a certain rate. And they're going to send out these waves of action potentials, which is going to cause atrial contraction and then going to trigger ventricular contraction. So the sinoatrial node is responsible for initiating the atrial contraction wave, right? So let's talk and let's think about where the sinoatrial node is. And this will make a little more sense if we take a look at the where these are located. So here is our heart model again, and Mr. Russell has drawn on here the basic locations of where we're going to find these different structures. So our SA node, sinoatrial node, is located again inferior to the vena cava, and typically it's a little bit on the anterior side of that vena cava. When it initiates its depolarization, the depolarization is going to start a wave of depolarization, which is going to travel down through the left atrium from that point inferiorly and across to, the right atrium and across to the left atrium. So if you think about this from a distance standpoint, the right atrium should contract just briefly before the left one does, because the sinoatrial node is found in the right atrium. So we're going to get contraction here just briefly before we get contraction here. And we're talking milliseconds. Now, this wave of depolarization is going to travel down, and it is going to then cause depolarization at number 2 right here. And number 2 is the AV node, right? Or the atrioventricular node. This is in the lower medial part of the interatrial septum, right? Kind of about the area where we saw the coronary sinus, that opening. Now, the AV node is going to then be what's responsible for allowing for the ventricles to contract. The ventricles are not going to contract from superior to inferior. The ventricles are going to instead contract from inferior to superior, right? Why would we want the ventricles to contract from the apex towards the base? Why would we want the ventricles to start their contraction here and contract upward? Huh?
To push the blood up.
Yeah, to push the blood up. I mean, look, where are the vessels? They're at the base up here. So if we started contraction of the ventricles here and the wave of contraction went from superior to inferior, we would be, this is a very scientific term, we would be squishing the blood down towards the apex. Well, we don't want to squish the blood down. We want to squish the blood up. So the ventricles are going to start to contract from the apex, and they're going to contract superiorly so that we can eject the blood up through these great vessels. So that means we can't just start a wave of depolarization here and let it spread like we did in the atria. The atria we want to contract superiorly and inferiorly, but the ventricles we want to come inferior to superior. So what's going to happen is the AV node here is going to kind of act like a lightning rod, and it's going to depolarize based on the SA node's depolarization. As the AV node depolarizes, it's then going to send that depolarization wave through a bundle of fibers called the bundle of His. Now, you can also refer to it as the AV bundle. This is going to be in the top part of the interventricular septum, okay? So the AV bundle, or the bundle of His, is going to be this portion right here, okay, as it's coming down through the interventricular septum. Now, once it gets far enough down into the interventricular septum, it is then going to branch, okay, into a right branch and a left branch. Those right and left branches are going to continue then down the interventricular septum. And those are called the right and left bundle branches. Now, some of these branches are going to extend fibers into the papillary muscles. So they're going to begin the contraction of the papillary muscles. Remember, our papillary muscles are connected to our chordae tendineae. So basically what happens is these flaps that we have as the tricuspid and bicuspid valve, they're kind of like kitchen doors in a restaurant. All right. So any of you that have worked in a restaurant, waited tables or whatever, you know, the kitchen doors swing both ways, right? Those valves, okay, between the atria and the ventricles can swing both ways like this. We can't have them swing into the atria, because if we do, then the blood gets pumped back into the atria. So when they swing, we want them to swing and then stop right here. So essentially the chordae tendineae, what they're doing is they're acting as ropes, and the papillary muscles are acting to pull on those ropes. So before the ventricles contract, we're going to start pulling on these chordae tendineae, so that when those AV valves close, they close during ventricular contraction and they stop right here. The only thing that's stopping them right here is the chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles pulling down on them like this. Does that make sense? So as the impulses travel down these bundles, these bundle branches, we're going to start tightening up these papillary muscles. Now, as these bundle branches reach the apex, they're going to then start to wrap around the ventricles. And as they wrap around the ventricles, we then refer to them as the Purkinje fibers. And these are going to be the fibers that extend through the ventricular myocardium and are going to cause ventricular contraction to begin at that apex. And as it begins at that apex, the wave of contraction will move up, and that will eject blood superiorly, which is going to push the blood out through the vessels, but also push blood up against these valves. So as it pushes blood up against these valves, we need those valves to be tight and these papillary muscles to be strong so that no blood ends back up in the atrium. So we're going to start here at the SA node. We're going to depolarize through the atrium, causing atrial contraction. We're going to squeeze that blood down into the ventricle. Then we're going to depolarize here at the AV node, move through the bundle of His, down through the bundle branches, start papillary contraction, get to the apex, enter into the Purkinje fibers, and then really contract the ventricles to pump the blood out of the vessels. Now, we mentioned before about prolapse, about mitral valve prolapse. What that means is that this valve, under the tremendous amount of pressure it's under, this valve is allowing for blood to regurgitate back into this left atrium. And that's not good. We want all the blood to go out of the aorta. If it gurgles back into the left atrium, we're losing the efficiency of the heart. Now, what can cause that? Well, maybe the chordae tendineae have become weak and stretched. Maybe the papillary muscles are stretched, or maybe there's just a little bit of a defect in the valve itself. But if the valvular defect is severe enough, if we're losing too much blood into the atria, then oftentimes surgery needs to be done to go in and replace the valve. A lot of times, though, it's just something that people live with, okay? They have this, what used to commonly be called a heart murmur, where when you listen to the heart, you hear this little gurgling sound, and doctors say, oh, you have a heart murmur. That's typically meaning that there's something, mildly associated with that valve. Now, a lot of people have mitral valve, and it's not an issue because it's not serious enough. Now, would it become an issue? I guess possibly if you exercised hard enough, maybe your heart might not run as efficiently. But when we're getting a lot of blood flow back into the atrium, that's when heart efficiency decreases enough where you'd want to do a valvular replacement. Now, the other reason you'd want to do a valvular replacement is that people that have mitral valve prolapse, that valve, for some reason, is very prone to infection related to the staph bacteria. Anybody that has mitral valve prolapse, if you have that, you have to be very, very aware of staph infections, because that staph infection could end up in the heart. And if it ends up in the heart, it could cause valvular failure, which could lead then to systemic issues in the body. I actually know someone that had this happen, that they had mitral valve prolapse. They got an infection in their foot. They didn't put two and two together about the infection related to their mitral valve prolapse, and they ended up in the hospital with having heart-related issues and circulatory issues and things like that. And when the doctor ran tests, they found out that the valve had failed. And unfortunately, the valve had failed, and it went long enough before she did anything about it, that she had begun to have circulatory issues in one of her legs, and the tissue ended up gangrenous, and they ended up having to amputate that part of her leg. So, it's a serious thing. Mitral valve can be when it's associated with infections. In fact, when my dad was practicing, my dad was a dentist. When he was practicing, anybody that had mitral valve in the office had a big stamp on their chart that said MVP. That didn't mean they were important. It meant they had mitral valve prolapse. And if you have mitral valve prolapse, before you go have dental procedures, even as much as having your teeth cleaned, you have to be on a series of antibiotics for a week leading up to getting your teeth cleaned, because, when the hygienist is cleaning your teeth, they're popping that floss in and out. Bacteria in your mouth could get into the bloodstream, and it could cause an infection in the heart. And so they pre-medicate patients for dental work even. So, it's a serious condition that, can be problematic, but not if you, take the proper precautions. All right. Any questions about conduction and how how contraction takes place, as far as how it moves through the heart? Again, I don't spend time talking about, the depolarization thresholds and that kind of stuff in here. So I'm not going to ask you questions about that on the physiology test either. But you may want to read through the explanation here for lecture a little bit. All right, let's talk about our EKG and what we see on this EKG. Basically, what this EKG represents is the electrical changes that we see, or the electrical activity that we see in the heart during the waves of depolarization and the muscle contraction cycle that occurs between the atria and the ventricles. The first wave that we see on this EKG is the P wave. And this P wave, it represents atrial depolarization. So what's happening as this P wave hits, as we spike the electrical activity here, is that we're beginning the atrial contraction. Remember, the term depolarizing means contraction. Repolarizing means relaxation. Okay, you may remember that from A&P 1, but depolarization, contraction, repolarization, relaxation. So we get depolarization of the atrium right here. That depolarization is going to last almost to the beginning of this Q wave. Okay, so that contraction is going to last up to this point. Now the QRS complex, okay, right here, the QRS complex is going to reflect ventricular depolarization. So when the ventricle depolarizes, okay, we get the beginning of ventricular contraction. Now, ventricular contraction is going to last obviously significantly longer than the atrial contraction is. When the atria contract, they're pumping blood into the ventricles. But I mean, let's be honest, let's think about it. Look at the location of the atria to the ventricles. How's the majority of the blood getting from the atria to the ventricles? Gravity, right? I mean, look, if I'm pumping blood into the atria and the valves are open to the ventricles, gravity is going to pull most of the blood down into the ventricles at the same time. When the atria contract, they're going to basically be pushing and the rest of the blood and maximally filling the ventricles. But we're going to get most of the filling done by gravity itself. So that's one of the reasons why atrial contraction is not going to be as long. Now, ventricular contraction begins and it runs till about the T wave. The T wave represents ventricular repolarization. So we have atrial depolarization, we have ventricular depolarization, and I have ventricular repolarization. So what did I leave out?
Atrial repolarization.
I left out atrial repolarization, but when is the atria repolarizing?
As the ventricle is polarizing.
As the ventricle is depolarizing, right? So atrial repolarization is occurring right here. So we don't actually physically see the electrical part of atrial repolarization because it's masked by the ventricular depolarization. So it's kind of hidden on this graph. So, on the practical, you can be asked to label this graph: P wave, QRS, T wave, T segment, that type of stuff. But you also need to know what's going on at those points. So remember, you're not going to see atrial repolarization because it's happening the same time that the ventricle is contracting and depolarizing. So we described our P wave, we described the QRS, and we described the T wave. Now we have these intervals and these different segments. And these intervals and segments just kind of give us a little idea as to, hey, this is what's happening. And if we see something abnormal, this is what it could mean. When we talk about this PR, okay, or which is just a little bit longer than the PQ, okay, PR just brings us to here. But if we talk about the PR interval, this is the amount of time that it's required for the action potential to completely move through the atria, the AV node, and down through the rest of the conduction fibers. If this interval is longer, if this takes longer, meaning that when we do an EKG, if the time here, okay, that runs from right here to right here, if this is longer than normal, then obviously there's something that's causing a problem with the signal passing through the conduction system, right? Which means that there could be damage to the muscle fibers between the SA node and the Purkinje fibers, or there could be some scar tissue that's in the way, which is interfering with the conduction in that part of the EKG. Now the ST segment, okay, which we're getting from the end of our kind of the end of depolarization to the beginning of our repolarization, this ST segment, this is where we would see if it's above the baseline, this would be a good indication that the patient is having a heart attack at that moment, all right? So, when they, when you call 911 and you have somebody come out to your house because you think you're having a heart attack and they hook you up to an EKG machine in the ambulance, this is the segment that they're most commonly looking at, because this is the segment that's going to tell them, hey, yes, they're having a heart attack. The heart isn't getting enough oxygen because this is not where it's supposed to be. My mom, when I went up to her house over the holidays because she was having some issues. And one of the nights I was there, she thought she was having a heart attack. And, so we called 911, they got the ambulance out there. Well, and they got her in the ambulance, and, he came back and said, hey, look, we don't think she's having a heart attack. Fortunately, we're going to take her to the hospital just to run some tests, but we don't think it. And this is what gave them the inclination that she wasn't, okay? Because this part of the EKG looked normal. The QT interval, this is from the beginning of the depolarization wave of the ventricle to the end of the repolarization wave. So if this section is longer, okay, right here, then we know that there's some type of damage that has already occurred, meaning that they're not in an acute state of having some type of heart attack, but that they may have had one at a previous time. So again, make sure you know what these different intervals and waves mean for the physiology test, and make sure you can label this EKG. You might see this EKG on the anatomy test, because you can label it. And if you don't see it on the anatomy, it may turn up on the physiology test. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about is cardiac output. And cardiac output basically is the volume of blood that we can eject from either ventricle over the course of a minute, all right? So how successful is your heart at pumping blood? That's what cardiac output tells us. Now, everybody has cardiac output. I mean, you have cardiac output at rest, you have it during exercise, but what does cardiac output mean? How are we coming up with cardiac output? Cardiac output is based on two factors: heart rate, okay, which we can measure over the course of a minute, and stroke volume. Stroke volume is the amount of blood that the heart can eject in one ventricular contraction. Now, those two factors, okay, heart rate and stroke volume, they can change, right? I mean, when we exercise, we can increase our heart rate. But when we exercise, we don't necessarily increase our stroke volume while we're exercising. Stroke volume is something that we can manipulate by exercising, but not necessarily during exercise, okay, if that makes sense. right? You can improve the health and the strength of your heart and improve your stroke volume by exercising. When you exercise, your stroke volume is going to be what it is, and your heart rate is going to increase. That's going to determine how much blood your heart can pump in a minute. So the better shape you're in, the higher your cardiac output is going to be. The higher your cardiac output is, the longer you're going to be able to sustain exercise. Because remember, exercise and muscle fatigue is related to your body's ability to deliver nutrients and oxygen to the tissues. So if we can deliver the tissues and meet the demand of the tissues, you can continue to exercise. Well, what's that mean? It means your cardiac output needs to be able to be sustained for X amount of time. Now, there's a limiting factor to cardiac output, and the limiting factor is heart rate. Okay, we can only increase our heart rate so much, right? Now, everybody has a resting heart rate. You know, your resting heart rate is typically going to be between 60 and 80 beats a minute, right? And remember, your resting heart rate is under parasympathetic control. We spend the majority of our time in a parasympathetic state, but the parasympathetic nervous system is basically managing that resting heart rate. The sympathetic nervous system is going to be what stimulates the heart rate. So when we need the heart rate to ramp up, we're going to slow down our parasympathetic nervous system, and we're going to kick on our sympathetic nervous system. That sympathetic nervous system is going to be what accelerates the conduction and speeds up your heart rate. Why would we want to speed up the heart rate? To meet the demands of the body. So at rest, our heart should beat between 60 and 80 beats a minute. Okay, most people average about 75. Now, the better shape you're in, okay, the stronger your heart is, the fewer beats it has to make a minute. All right. The larger your stroke volume, the more your heart rate can go down. Heart rate and stroke volume are kind of inversely proportional. All right. If you have two individuals, okay, and two individuals, they're the same age, the same size, height, weight, everything. Basically, that means their cardiac output at rest should be the same. Okay, because we're delivering at rest the same amount of oxygen to the tissues needed, right? One person's cardiac output, though, could be based on a higher heart rate and a lower stroke volume. The other person's heart rate or cardiac output could be on a higher stroke volume and a lower heart rate, all right? For simplicity's sake, let's use some like easy numbers, all right? Let's say the two individuals we were just talking about, let's say their cardiac output needed to be 100, all right? And one person's heart rate was 10 beats a minute. That means that their stroke volume was also 10, because 10 times 10 is 100. Let's say the other person, though, their heart rate was 5 beats a minute. Well, that means that their stroke volume then is 20, because 5 times 20 is 100. Now, they're both moving the same volume of blood. They're both pumping out 100 units of blood. But one person is doing it in 5 beats, and the other person is doing it in 10 beats. Well, who's in better shape? The person beating in 5 beats, because their heart is working half the amount of time to pump the same volume of blood in a minute. Because every time the heart contracts, it's pumping 20 units, and this person's heart is pumping 10. So you see how that relationship kind of changes? If cardiac output doesn't change, then when heart rate goes up, stroke volume has to go down. When heart rate goes down, stroke volume goes up. So we're talking at rest. Now, what happens when we exercise? Well, when we exercise, our heart rate is going to increase. So you say, okay, well, Dr. B, no problem. My heart rate can just continue to go up. That means I can continue to exercise and exercise harder. No, you can't, because your heart rate has a ceiling. Your heart can only beat so many times a minute, not because because it gets tired, but also when heart rate gets to the point where it's beating too fast, we're not allowing the chambers enough time to properly fill. So you're getting a heart that's contracting faster than the chambers can fill up. So let's say your heart rate gets up to 180. Your heart's not filling up properly. And so when the heart's beating, it's not pumping blood. Guess what your body is going to do? It's going to make the heart go faster, because it's going to go, hey, we're not getting enough blood. I better speed up the heart. And so that's when our heart gets into a state of what we call fibrillation, where the heart's just quivering like that because it's trying to beat so fast, but it's not pumping the blood that it needs to. That's dangerous. So there's a ceiling as to where our heart can beat. But what there isn't a ceiling to is how much blood our heart can pump. I mean, I guess there probably is a ceiling, but that's what we can improve on. So if I exercise and I strengthen my heart, and remember, when I say strengthen my heart, what I'm doing while I exercise is not just making my heart more endurance strong, but I'm also asking the heart to take more blood in. There's a law called the Frank Starling's law of the heart, and this is related to the pre-stretch of the heart before contraction. When we pump blood from the atria into the ventricles, we want to pump as much as we can, because the bigger the ventricle is, the bigger the chamber is, the more blood we can fill. And the more blood I can fit in the ventricle, then the more blood I can pump out of the heart when the ventricle contracts. So the bigger the preload of the ventricle, the more stroke volume I can have. Well, if my stroke volume increases, then my resting heart rate can decrease, because my cardiac output is going to stay the same. If I start with a lower resting heart rate, I have more room for improvement when I exercise. If my resting heart rate is 50, when I go to exercise, if I get my heart rate up to 150, I've increased it 100 beats a minute. What if my resting heart rate is 100? Now I can only increase my heart rate 50 beats a minute. So my heart isn't going to be as efficient. This is why people that are triathletes or marathon runners or cyclists, their resting heart rate sometimes can be down in the upper 30s or the low 40s. That means that at rest, their heart is only beating like 40 times a minute. Why? Because the volume of blood that's contained in the ventricles is so large that when the heart beats, it's ejecting twice the volume of somebody whose heart rate is at 80 beats a minute. Does this make sense to everyone, how these two are related, how heart rate and stroke volume? And do you see then why, when you exercise, your stroke volume plays such an important role? Look, if you're not in shape and you go run, you're training your heart to increase its endurance, but you're also training your heart to accept more blood into the ventricles. When you train a muscle, you need to make it stronger, but you also need to increase its elasticity. You need to increase its ability to stretch. That's what we're doing with our heart. And the stronger we can make our heart during exercise, the better. Why? That increases heart size, increases the size of the ventricles, and increases our stroke volume. Now, a big heart based on exercise is a good thing. A big heart not based on exercise is a bad thing. Why would the heart get bigger when we're not exercising? Well, what if the heart works harder at rest? We want the heart to work harder during exercise, but we don't want it to work harder at rest. If it works harder at rest, guess what's going to happen? It's still going to get big. But what are we not doing? We're not stretching the chambers. So the chambers are actually going to get smaller, which means the heart's going to become less efficient. So what causes the heart to to work harder at rest? Well, fluid on the heart. We talked about that at the beginning of class. That's one of the things. Pressure on the heart can make it work faster, either by fluid on the heart or fatty tissue on the heart, right? What's another thing can make the heart work harder? High blood pressure. If your pressure in your arteries is high, like we're going to talk about next week, if the pressure in your arteries is high, that puts pressure back on the heart. That means that when you're just sitting there watching TV, your heart is working harder than it should. That means that your heart is going to get to a point where it becomes less efficient. Blood pressure is a problem. High blood pressure is a problem, not just because of the pressure it puts in the vessels themselves, but because of the pressure it puts back on the heart and can cause congestive heart failure. Okay, the heart pumping, but not pumping efficiently enough. All right. So what should happen, like we said, as we start to exercise? Well, obviously your heart rate is going to go up, but again, it's going to max out. Okay, so if we want to see your cardiac output increase for the purposes of exercising, you have to increase the stroke volume because your heart rate is going to go up no matter what. So the more you can, the higher stroke volume you can have, the more efficient and cardiovascularly trained your heart's going to be. And that's kind of what that physiology exercise that we're going to talk about next week and that you have for extra credit, that's kind of what that goes into. All right. Any questions?